More than 60,000 Korean Canadians call Toronto home. But until very recently, the sacrifices and successes of this community have barely been told. Happily, books like N.Y.K. Choi's first novel, K's Lucky Coin Variety, are helping to change that. It was a finalist for the 2016 Toronto Book Award, and it brings Anne to our studio today. Welcome, Anne.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
I'm glad you're here. I really enjoyed the book. So, my family's from East Africa, and your family's from Korea. Reading the book, though, I could identify with so much of what you wrote about Mary's family. Like when we first moved to Canada, my name had to be changed to, ironically, Mary, which actually is really quite interesting, right? I guess it happened to a lot of kids. Why was it important for you to tell this particular story?
My daughter, so I have a 17-year-old daughter who grew up believing that my parents, her grandparents, have a very comfortable, easy life. They're retired now. They play golf. And I realized, it dawned on me that she had no idea what it was like when we first immigrated to Canada, and things like the name changes and having a variety store is so much more work than people actually know or can appreciate. So I felt compelled to tell our stories so that she knew and was aware, and not just her, but others, her generation. It dawned on me that the variety store generation, what my family did, and the families I knew growing up, we were all dying off, right? We were all moving on to other things, and
Meaning that the older
generation
generation.
of shopkeepers, right, were now retired, and their children had gone on and lived their immigrant dreams. So unless I wrote a book, right, and told the story, it would become lost, right? So that's why I wrote the story.
Was there a moment, a specific moment that's, encouraged you or pushed you to write the book?
Just reflecting back, because now our family has been in Canada for over 40 years, and I think it's taken me a long, long time to explore issues around identity, a sense of belonging. My daughter is so proud to be half Irish, half Korean. And I remember when she was born, really, really wanting to make sure that she grew up proud of both heritages, because it's easy to be proud of her Irish heritage in Toronto because there's, Irish pubs, the St. Patrick's Day parade. But I grew up and there was really nothing that reflected the Korean culture. So again, we tried very, very hard. It's easy now to be proud. There's a Korean restaurant on almost every corner, but that wasn't the case. So again, I felt it was important to go back to the beginning and showcase what it meant to be a Korean Canadian in the early 70s, 80s, and now.
Is that why you said it in the 80s?
And again, this is my first book, so a lot of the things that happened to my main character mirrors my own experiences. And it was really as a teenager, around 15, 16, that I started thinking about, again, what it meant to be a Korean Canadian in Toronto. It's kind of hard for me to really admit and share that I grew up really embarrassed of a lot of aspects of my culture. Again, in the 70s and 80s, there was really nothing in my immediate surroundings that reflected the Korean culture. It wasn't, I remember feeling really self-conscious coming out of Korean restaurants, right? Like I smelled like Korean food. I remember even like what you bring for lunch, right?
Is this something like, I think a lot of people watching this can probably identify that embarrassment, especially if you visibly appear to be not from Canada. Like,
Right, right.
So do you think those things came from within your Korean community or from other people, like at school, like being embarrassed of eating like Korean food? Was that something that?
It's, I think, I remember when I first came feeling very alone, right? And
Why
again,
did you feel alone?
for example, some of the schools that we went to, like I have two younger brothers, we were like the only Asians in the whole school, right? And so again, when you don't see your background represented in anything, I didn't even realize the importance of having role models, right? And because again, I didn't even think I could write a book and tell a story until I became aware of other Asian Canadians and Asian American writers. Um, I think again, just the absence, like you feel invisible and you can't, the idea of being visible isn't even there. I was so happy to be invisible. That sounds horrible, but when you're invisible, you don't get picked on, right? When you're invisible, nobody makes any demands of you.
But the irony is that you were visible because, like you said, you were one of very few. So everybody saw you.
And because I think too, when you are alone and everyone sees, I worked even harder to blend. One of my biggest obsessions in high school was, believe it or not, like to marry a white man, and so I could take his last name and lose my Asian name.
That's heartbreaking.
Right, and it was because again, in high school, all I ever studied about the Asian culture and background was what Canada did to the Chinese at the turn of the century with the head tax. I learned about the Japanese internment, right, during World War II, and that's about all I ever learned about the. And in my warped mind growing up, I thought, oh my goodness, history can repeat itself, and I sensed this weird. Paranoid that it might happen again. And so I remember at one point thinking, well, how, and my last name sounds so Asian, how could I lose that name?
So you're trying to find ways to defend yourself, to
and
protect
to,
yourself.
Again, and blend, and not only for me, but for any children I might have, right?
How old were you when you were?
15, 16, right? Which is my protagonist at the book. But I was processing all that and you kind of lose yourself. But again, if you don't see your world reflected anywhere, and all you see is your heritage or people of that background buried in history books as victims, right? It's hard to move past that, right? And it wasn't until I again. Got to the university, I discovered Black writers. I discovered Indigenous.
You went to University of Toronto?
Right, and again, but not in the classroom, right? But it was through meeting other people, right, and talking to other students. And I had one incredible professor, a sociology professor. In fact, I think everybody should study sociology because it was the first time I was forced to critically think about what it means to
exist in the world
and become visible. Right? And what are some of the responsibilities that come with suddenly having the spotlight on you, right? And it helps.
So you're moving from being invisible, trying to be invisible, and now to having accepting that the spotlight is on you. And what are you going to do with that?
And right now, because I feel like, so I wrote this story, and it took me decades to get this story out, right? So, because the idea for the story came, I struggled with mental health, right? Mental illness in high school. And one of the projects that one of my counselors gave me when I was at the University of Toronto was find out what other Korean Canadian females, what makes them happy, right? What makes them feel good. So I started informally interviewing all these women and asking, you know, what makes you happy? What makes you feel a sense of belong and feel included? And the more I talked to them, the more I realized, oh my gosh, they were unhappy. They were unhappy. And suddenly I felt better. Their unhappiness made me feel like I wasn't alone, right? And that they were struggling with the same issues around identity, parental expectations, mental illness. And then the world around us was changing because then the Korean Canadian presence, right? And just in terms of K-pop, K-drama, Korean restaurants, so I felt
becoming more mainstream.
Right, and so all of a sudden I didn't feel so alone, and so then this book came to being.
And it's a work of fiction,
which
I think is interesting. Why not write a memoir? Because you write about a young girl called Mary and her family.
At the time, I think at some point I might. I don't think I have the emotional courage at this point because there's still so much I'm working through. so much that I'm still learning, right? It's and again, because this book, it took decades to come into being, right? So it started as a collection of poems, because a lot of mental health experts will tell you to write if you're struggling with any kind of depression or other mental illness. So I wrote a collection of poems in the early 90s. And the poems evolved into a short story, and then the short story evolved into a book.
And the women that you were talking about before that you interviewed, did they
Right.
help to, their experiences, did they help to craft any of the characters in the book?
So my main character is actually a compilation of all these females that were voiceless. Because again, I interviewed these women one-on-one, and promising them that I would never disclose what they shared with me, right? So I felt like we were all these whispers in the dark. And so for the longest time, I wanted to write this book, but I didn't necessarily have the courage or the tools to do so. But I was haunted and chased almost relentlessly by these voices that evolved and wove themselves into my main character, Mary.
You mentioned mental health, which I want to talk about in a little bit, but I want to talk about the setting, which is in a variety store.
Yes.
And there's a moment in the book, a robbery, that shows how dangerous it is to work in a variety store. How common were experiences like that in your own personal life?
It's and it's something, again, we don't really talk about,
Why
right?
is that?
Um,
Because in the book, you also
right.
mentioned that the attacks were never really reported.
Right, again, because you don't want your business to have a reputation for, because again, at some point you want to sell the store, right? And you want customers to feel comfortable walking into it and feel safe. So really, you don't want to draw, you
Like
don't
bad
want
press.
bad press, have police presence everywhere. Because again, for many shopkeepers' families, it wasn't just a business, it was home. A lot of families live above the store, right? So it's much bigger than just a place where one worked. It was everything. So
Were robberies like common?
and again, this was the 80s, so a lot of it was more like knives and just people threatening to rob. I think, again, too, depending on where our store was, but moving beyond, because again, you get bored in the store, right? There's so much work in terms of stocking, in terms of
Not being able to interact with kids your age after school because you have a job to do, right?
and
Or responsibility.
right. And it's funny because a lot of our friends would say, "Oh, it must be so cool to have a store. You know, you get free candy, free cigarettes,
That's what I was thinking.
right? And then later on, free condoms, free everything,
Yeah.
right?" But you know, there were times where I remember coming home, seeing my mom completely distressed because she had been robbed earlier, being afraid to be in the store by yourself at night. My parents never attended any of my high school recitals because, again, they had to be in the store, right? So, and I think as a kid, as a teenager, it's hard sometimes not to be resentful of that, especially when you see white families where the parents made it a priority to be there to support their kids. It's not until much, much later, like, and again, part of writing the book was therapy for me because I grew up so angry.
Why were you angry?
So angry with my parents and especially my mom because I felt she was imposing a dream, her dream on me, right? But writing the book really, really helped me to get past that and to see the bigger picture. I think I spent so many years trying to forgive my mother. And writing this book, really, the biggest takeaway for me, there was nothing ever to forgive. Right? Oh my gosh! And just coming to terms
When did that
with
realization come?
at the very end, at the very, very end, when I I did the dedications, right? And I thought about the people who mattered most to me and really why and who I wrote the book for. There's like nothing to forgive, right? Because again, she did, we all did what we could and what we needed to in that moment. And to move on and Yeah,
You said that you were angry at your mother. You spent a
right,
lot of your time angry at your mom
right,
because of the dreams that she had for you.
right.
What were those dreams that she had for you that I'm guessing you didn't want?
You know what? My parents kept telling us, kept reminding us that we came to Canada for us, like so we could have a better life. She really wanted us to live Korean lives in Canada, right? Which meant, marrying a Korean man, having Korean grandchildren, speaking the language. And again, all I ever wanted was to be Canadian, right? And I still don't even know what that means. I just knew that I wanted to be Canadian, and I felt my mother just wanted to keep me locked in little Korea.
You've said that you were obsessed with learning English. Why?
Well, that goes right to the beginning. When we first came to Canada, that was 1975, so I didn't speak a word of English. And I remember entering the school system and being told that this was my new name. Um, when you don't speak the language, you're an easy target for bullying, for just being excluded. And I learned really early on how awful it can feel when you don't have access to a language. There were times where there was this one incident where, I got into a thing with a boy, and he was able to defend himself, and I couldn't. And I remember feeling so helpless, and I knew I was in the right, but because I couldn't defend myself, it just, I thought in that moment that unless I gave up my Korean and learned English, that life will be a constant struggle in this country. So in my 7-year-old mind, I made a commitment to myself that I would learn English. I would learn English to the point where I would be able to defend myself, my family, because I knew we were going to stay in this country.
I find it interesting that you said that you had lost your name, but then you chose, well, not chose, maybe that's too strong a word for a 7-year-old, but you decided to focus on speaking English. Do you speak your native language, your birth language?
And again, in my commitment and determination to learn English, I thought as a child I had to give up one for the other. And one of my biggest frustrations right now is that I don't have the Korean language. And I'm learning what a barrier it is not to have access to a language. Recently, I did a panel discussion for a group of visiting Korean students. I had to have a translator. And it actually broke my heart, and it made me very, very sad that here I was writing about a Korean Canadian immigrant family, and I didn't have access to the Korean language. I also learned too that at this point, I am ready to embrace the Korean culture and really, really celebrate, especially with my daughter. But without the language, I'm facing barriers and I'm facing obstacles. The Korean papers have been very kind in writing about me and sharing my journey, and yet I have to have somebody translate it for me. I can't read it. And
How does that make you feel?
awful. Awful. In fact, I feel like going to school and telling all my ESL students, whatever you do, hold on to your language. It may not feel important now, but when you get to a point where you're reflecting back, and
So what changed for you? Is it you becoming a parent? Or
it's when I started feeling comfortable in my own skin, right? And again, moving forward, because there's aspects of the Korean culture that now I really want to explore. And again, but without language, you can't have the discussion with people, you can't read about it. I recently completed my first beginner Korean class.
congratulations.
And thank you, that was really exciting. And my long-term goal is now to really learn the language. It also got me thinking too that my parents, when they first came, without the language, what it must have been like. I think having that second language makes us more empathetic, makes us better and bigger.
And you've also, one of the other themes in the book is mental health, which we mentioned earlier. What kind of mental health issues do the characters deal with in the book?
In the late 80s, 90s, and it's only recently that I actually started talking about my own struggles with mental health and with mental illness. It's something that I think a lot of female immigrant girls struggle with at some point in terms of their identity. And identity is so layered. But and again, I work as a guidance counselor. And in writing the book, one of the things that I came to realize is the things that I struggled with, right? The relationships with my mother, the anger, anxiety, depression, all of these things my students were facing 20 years later. And initially, I was overwhelmed, and it actually made me feel sad. But then trying to think bigger picture, I think we're in a much, much better place. We are talking about it now. And again, everything comes back to language. Somebody said to me, you know what, it seems so much more complex now, right? The discussions are bigger, there's more politically correct language that we have to learn. But I realize the issues, the problems are exactly the same. We are now naming it, right? And in naming it, we can talk about it. But also in naming it, how do we, because it could be uncomfortable, right? So how do we move forward and have these meaningful conversations? One of the things that growing up, I talked to my counselors, and again, they were amazing. Like, if I could find my guidance counselors when I was in high school, I would just hug them because I always go back to what they did for me. But one of the things that I really, really hope is working as a group, right? So that we're looking at the students, we're looking at the parents and the community, and we're looking at the educators, and we are speaking the same language. Everything comes back to language. That's my
Communication.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. We have to speak the same language, and so that we could have really meaningful conversations. Because I think what I wanted and what my friends wanted back in the 80s is what I want for my daughter, for my students, and really ultimately it boils down to we want everyone to feel healthy, we want everyone to feel safe, and we want people to feel a sense of belonging.
Right. You mentioned that it's more in girls than boys. One of the characters in the book is a guy, and he has a mental health issue. From your work, do you find that there's a difference between boys and girls?
Going back to what I experienced and what I knew of my friends growing up, I think there are gender differences, especially like in the Korean culture, in the Asian culture. And actually, I think it's quite universal. There's a lot of expectations on the boys and what that could mean. And that's, again, some of the things that I look at in the book. The brother says to the sister, at least, you know, you're free. You could marry whomever you want and go on, where there's this expectation that he will honor the family name. And even after parents die, there's that expectation that the oldest male will honor and practice ancestor worship, and it just goes on and on. I think there are expectations that are different, and each has its own unique challenges.
What kind of advice would you give kids who are going through mental health struggles right now?
There's been a lot of research around resiliency. We know that if you talk to at least one person and you connect with one person, it makes the biggest difference. I think when I was struggling, you feel like you're like on an island. You really, really do. And I think, and the fact after, I actually did a project where, you know, one of my counselors, one of my therapists said, go talk to other women in your situation and find out what makes them happy. And in doing that, I found out everything that made them unhappy. And that was so liberating because I learned at that point we were all on these little islands in downtown Toronto.
And you were all experiencing the
same things, right? Yeah. And it was just crazy to be able to reach out to each other and build bridges and be able to talk to each other. I really would encourage any young person to connect with somebody, and because even if that one person doesn't know what to do, that person could in turn connect that person to someone else and build more bridges.
What do you hope people will take away from your book?
At the most basic level, I wanted to tell the journey about a Korean Canadian family. But then speaking with other readers, I realized that it's about families, it's about relationships. The mother-daughter relationship is something that a lot of readers, and when I do book talks, right, it comes back to that. It's I really hope that it begins dialogue, it begins conversations, and the book is set in the 80s, but I think a lot of what's at the core, at the heart, is relevant today, so that if it could trigger conversations, help us move forward, right? Especially in supporting our young people. Like right now, that's been, and I feel very privileged because I've been able to talk to a wide range of, like with book clubs and with adults, but I love talking to young people because part of the things that come back is, oh, I really want to do this, but my parents or my guardians, they won't let me. And again, just getting them excited about following something that's really important to them, that inspires me to actually want to go out and write more books.
Well, congratulations on this book. I mean, something, you didn't speak the language, you wanted to learn the language, and now you've written a book. So kudos to you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for being here, Anne.
Thank you.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.